Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Broad College of Business at Michigan State University. We are pleased you're here with us today and want to welcome you to the fifth in a series of webinars on supply chain disruption amid COVID-19. My role today is to help you with any technology issues that you may run into. So please reach out to me via chat, Q&A, or email, which you see displayed there on the screen right now. Throughout the presentation, we welcome your questions and have saved time near the end of this webinar to give some of those questions to the two presenters today. To submit your questions, please click or tap the Q&A button on your device or your phone and submit your questions. We thank you in advance for doing that and welcome you to do that throughout the presentation. And now, good afternoon, Dave, welcome.
Good afternoon, Marcy, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Marcy, for all the great work you're doing, helping to prepare for and helping us manage these sessions. I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us for the fifth in our series of webinars focused on supply chain disruption amid COVID-19. My name is Dave Freyer. I'm Assistant Dean for Outreach and Engagement in the Broad College of Business at Michigan State University. I'm going to serve as your moderator again today. I also want to acknowledge we're being assisted today by Nick Little from our Center for Railway Research and Education, and of course, Marcy Stoll from our Executive Development Programs team. This session is being recorded and will be available on the Broad College YouTube channel here in just a few days. Today, our session is really going to focus on lessons learned from the COVID-19 pandemic and some considerations and recommendations for how organizations can move forward successfully. Obviously, as many of you are aware, there are a tremendous number of challenges and changes that have taken place as a result of the pandemic. We're probably not going to cover every single one of them, but we are going to try today and really focus on a few core things that are, I think, very worthy of consideration by most all organizations globally. I'm very pleased to be joined by two of our faculty experts from the Supply Chain Management Department here in the Broad College. First, Dr. Stan Griffiths, who is the Bowersox-Thull Endowed Professor, and Dr. Sriram Narayanan, who is the Kessler Family Endowed Faculty Fellow and Professor in Supply Chain. As usual, our format today is going to involve our panelists responding to a few key questions concerning lessons learned from the global pandemic. But we also, as Marcy said, will welcome your questions, and we'll address as many of these as we possibly can at the end of our session today. So, over the past year, we've obviously seen how the global pandemic's created some incredible challenges for organizations, and we've seen supply chain professionals across the globe really rise to the challenge, dealing with unique issues and unique challenges that I think none of us perhaps had anticipated. But today our focus is really going to be 12 months in to this pandemic. What have we learned? And so really to get us started, I'd like the panelists to take a few minutes and kind of talk about some of the things that they've seen in their research and their outreach and engagement activities with organizations. And so, very specifically, what have we learned about supply chain design and operations through the pandemic? And to start us off, Stan, why don't I ask you to kind of reflect a little bit on this and what you've seen in your activities to date?
Thank you, Dave, and thank the whole team for setting this up, and for all our participants, thank you for attending and your questions upcoming. I guess in the engagement that I've had in the last year, Dave, the thing I keep hearing more and more about is our systems maybe aren't designed for what people are experiencing and seeing, and the imbalances that have been observed over the course of the pandemic really are stressing the different systems that organizations have. And if you think, what seems like a long way back, right? But back to, people wanted more toilet paper, more paper towel, there wasn't enough. So supply and demand were imbalanced. The range of products that either businesses were looking for or consumers were looking for really shrunk down to a much smaller set than their customers and their suppliers were accustomed to delivering to their customers. And so these imbalances really started to stress the systems. I actually, when we were sitting here in the 5 minutes prior, I started thinking about, the terms that we talk about: agility and flexibility. And I'll confess, I'm a New England Patriots and Tom Brady fan, and he's a big fan of pliability, and attests a lot of his ability to perform over long periods of time, to the ability to adapt to changing scenarios. And I think that's something that's lacking in the systems for the last 2 decades. And I don't mean that lean is not a good approach, but we have maybe taken lean to an extent to where it's gotten us into a space where our systems are a little bit brittle. And in those systems, I often come at stuff from a bit of a locational researcher's perspective. Do we have facilities in the right locations? Manufacturing, we saw the PPE that we were getting from extended distance suppliers. And when things shut down, either it took too long to get here, or maybe that supply was redirected to the host nation where those things are manufactured. And so do we have enough flexibility in our supply base? Do we have enough flexibility in ways to move things around? We had modes of transportation virtually get shut down, whereas others were overwhelmed with demand for certain types of products. And so that flexibility, pliability, agility, there's all the ilities get thrown at these at some point. But I think one of the things we've learned is that where we're going is going to be different from where we've been this last year, which is different from where we've been for years and years before that. And there's open questions about where we get things done, how we get things done, how does this all work in this new environment? And I wish we could all see the future and know what 15 months from now looks like, because it would be a whole lot easier to start planning. But that's another of the challenges, is that we don't know if we're going to get back to normal, what that normal is going to look like, and how and where we'll do those things.
That's I appreciate that very much, Stan, because it kind of reminds me of so much of the time and effort that we as supply chain professionals spend, right? Trying to do a little bit of that prognostication, right? Where are we going? What are we going to see? And trying to develop very specific and very exacting plans for the future. And yet that's hard. That's hard to do, especially in an environment of dramatic change like we've seen.
Forecasting has always been a challenge. It's something we work with our students to learn how to do the best job they can of, knowing they'll never be perfect. But boy, it's all, it's not out the window, but it's on the ledge.
Yeah. Understand. That's great. Appreciate it. Sriram, what kinds of things have you been seeing in the work that you've been doing?
Well, thank you, Dave, and I certainly want to thank the organizers for having me here in this webinar. In the last 4 to 5 years, I've been focusing quite a lot on sustainability and ideas around community engagement, corporate social responsibility for supply chains. What I'm seeing is that this is probably the ideal time where the importance of this issue has been dramatically, I would say, emphasized by COVID. We've always had inequities in society, and given the current challenges, I do feel the big idea around community engagement. In fact, like I put in the slide here, Larry Fink, he's the CEO of BlackRock. They have about $8.7 trillion in their portfolio, and he in fact wrote this in the most recent letter to all the CEOs that companies must be deliberate and committed to embracing purpose and serving stakeholders. So really, the idea is that it's not shareholder wealth anymore, and that requires a different kind of thinking about supply chains and how we design them. And that's something that I feel all corporations today have to face, hopefully down the road. And there are some systemic changes that are going to be happening because of this that we really need to get our heads around. That's one big takeaway as far as my research goes. The other thing I think is that processes are as valuable as products. I'm going to be talking about some examples later on as we dig in. So the importance of how companies can focus on processes, pivot their processes to doing something fundamentally different. But that requires some deeper level of reflection and preparation, and issues like hyper agility. So I also teach a course on new product development and agile product development and others. But I find that what many of the companies have managed to do as a result of pandemic requires a fundamentally different way to think about agility itself. I mean, many people have taken it to a totally different level. So what it sort of tells me is that companies are capable of way more than what they know they are capable of, and that reflection really needs to happen. The last thing I think is really about capacity. So in supply chain we are all about demand supply matching. Capacity is really an integral element of it. And what I think the pandemic has put out is this idea of capacity is not your own. You could actually think about capacity at fundamentally different levels. And I'm going to hopefully, as we dig in, point out to some examples on that. So if you want to exploit that, I would say that senior executives need to have a plan and some structure around scenarios for capacity use down the road. So that's what I would say. So if you go to the next slide, all of these points to me are backed by two components, right? So one is that, and this is certainly my fundamental belief, that organizations need to be community facing. They need to face community challenges. And we have research both on two sides, as we call it, individual flexibility. I'm going to label them flexibility because it's really your abilities that are flexible. And particularly on the community side, we have a bunch of work around disability inclusion in factories and what is the impact on productivity and ROI. And we also are doing research around how companies did new product process pivots that fundamentally can change the way they look at their own business, right? And what we like to propose, this thing called community engaged supply chains. I think supply chains down the road that are more community facing are certainly going to add more wealth to the overall corporation down the road. That's sort of what I would say in summary.
Thanks, Shriram. It's really interesting, right? A lot of alignment between there. How do we create flexibility, adaptability, all of those things? And it's related to systems, processes, and people, right? And how we're actually addressing those things. And so, Shriram, maybe coming back to you, given what you've just shared and this community engaged orientation that you've painted for us, what are some of the challenges that we're going to have to deal with and try and overcome if we want to operationalize that type of an overall strategy?
I think perhaps I put a slide there so the audience can at least look at some bullets as we sort of speak. So I think that one of the things that we really need to worry about is that at a strategic level, we need to orient ourselves to a different paradigm of thinking. When I say a different paradigm of thinking, in supply chains, we have a traditionally standardization mindset. And it's not particularly wrong because a standardization mindset gives us more efficiency. But I think the richness of the context around which the standardization happens is really important to understand. So for example, if we take, we have some work around disability inclusion in task environments and structures. And what we are finding is that, if you take a very standardized approach to supply chain designs, task design, that element can actually get you into challenges with respect to not focusing on individual abilities, for example. And if we want to do that, then, the entire HR systems, processes, recruitment, how we support people need to be thought through. It's not like they are rocket science, but I think it's just that it's a different way of thinking. So the first question really to me is, are we asking how are corporations serving their local communities? Do they have their back? That would be the first question, right? So that requires starting from a different point, at least in my view. The second part, I think, is that considering a culture that takes holistic view of the firm, and this comes straight from Larry Fink's letter. that, the stakeholders are not just the shareholders. And I understand many times we have a corporate quarterly mindset, and those dollars and cents are important. But at the same time, we need a longer term mindset, particularly when you want to become community focused. So we want to take a holistic view about what the supply chain is contributing to the firm. And that's not easy. I think our environments are not tuned to looking at that at all. And really the last component is, and we have been talking about this for ages, but I guess in COVID, the importance of this comes out to the fore truly, that we want to proactively map competencies. What are we really good at, but not just our competencies, but also what are the competencies available in the ecosystem, right? So we need to be aware of what are the firms around us, how they are going to be contributing to the supply chain ideas. And in some ways, we are now talking a lot about this phenomenon of industrial commons, how there is increased visibility of competencies of designing supply chains on the fly from different firms coming together, particularly things like, for example, 3D printing. You can actually make the entire manufacturing more networked. How do we leverage these? I mean, these are, I think, the challenges down the road in terms of how we think about newer forms of supply chain designs.
So it's really interesting, Sriram, because you're talking about a very different way of thinking about the firm and its role, and as a result, the goals and objectives and metrics that it puts in place to try and do this. And Stan has just pointed out the challenges that we have related to how do we recognize and adapt flexible strategies and things of that nature. Stan, I'm kind of curious, how do these notions line up with some of the things that you're seeing as well? Are these consistent, or are they dramatically different? What do you think?
Yeah, it's very consistent. I'm actually going to jump off of one of the points that Sriram made. Near the end, he talked about system design, and as I alluded to earlier, I tend to play in the network design and supply chain design. It's a more strategic level, but it seems like businesses have three options available to them when they're looking at their network as it currently sits, and looking forward to that chasm of where are we going that we talked about in your prior question. I mean, three options it seems. The first one is don't do anything. Just cast yourself into the waters and see where they take you. It appears risky, but it is an option to be that second or third mover in whatever this next phase is. So I'm not going to talk a lot about that. The other two options, the first of them would seem to be maybe what we need to do is reconsider that network. And I alluded to earlier that we were at great distances trying to get PPE. There's been a lot of things in the press very recently about the slowdown in chip production that has happened amid the pandemic, and the upturn in the needs of these as a lot of the big three go to electric vehicles, which require a lot more chips to them than the hydraulic and mechanical systems that they used to have. All the big three are talking about slowdowns in their plants, big hits to revenue. And so maybe those networks need to change to continue to operate the way we've been operating. And so that chip provider maybe needs to be closer to us. We may need more regionalized supply chains. There had been a bit of a trend of reshoring of things that 20 some odd years ago got sent to the Pacific Rim, but now we're coming back to North America, maybe not the US, but to North America. And so the reconfiguration of our networks, who are the suppliers, who are the customers we're going to serve, can we serve, as extensively as we did, particularly amid this constriction, at least temporarily, of what it is that is demanded by a lot of the customers that are out there. And so we can look at the network and maybe change it. The other thing that potentially exists is maybe the network's good, but the products and services and processes that would support those may need to change to do something different. We've very visibly seen, at Michigan State, the pavilion is being used to do COVID checks for people if we end up in a situation where we will be dispensing shots, they will likely use that. The NFL just recently turned over all of its stadium parking lots to be used in this way. The Sears infrastructure that was, dying on the vine with the slow death of the Sears company suddenly turned out to be extremely valuable amid COVID, because the location people that built that network of stores didn't put them in the city center. They put them near the edges of the city, close to interstates with good parking lots. And we saw a big uptick in Sears facilities being used to be testing locations for COVID. And so that kind of thinking of saying, okay, maybe my network's good, but maybe what I'm going to the marketplace with, product or service wise, and we've seen a lot of us change the way we purchase. Rather than it just be e-commerce, we've got all kinds of buy online, pick up in store, and Grubhub and businesses like this. Maybe there are networks that are established, that are doing A, but maybe B or C might be a good opportunity going forward. And so, among those three, which will it be? I think every business is going to have to kind of decide for themselves. But there's an opportunity to a lot of these challenges, and viewing those as opportunities rather than merely something to deal with, maybe a good way to come at that.
That's it's really interesting, because corporate mindset and how do we frame and deal with these issues, the issues of network design, relationships, how we think systematically about these things, where we can create flexibility. And then, Sriram, you brought up this issue of people. I think that availability of labor and so many things really came out very clearly during the pandemic. Can you take a little more time and talk to us about some of the things that you're really seeing that are possible, related to this community engaged model and some of the inclusive activities that you've been working on so diligently?
Thank you, Dave. I think I'll point to a couple of different issues. So one is that if you look at the employment numbers today, of course, we had historically low unemployment rates right before the pandemic hit. But at the same time, what we never moved the needle on was this idea of disability employment, right? So I think that the gap, you probably want to click on that one more time, Dave. Thank you. So the gap on this is that the percentage disability unemployment gap is almost 47%, according to the BLS statistic. Right now we think about this. The moment COVID hit, disability, poverty, healthcare access, all of them are deeply intertwined. It's just a question of how do you get people to work in environments when you still need capacity. Things like meatpacking plants had serious staffing shortfalls, but we hardly know how we can staff them up, because we don't know whether these organizations, we are sort of in a firefighting mode at that time, but really we don't have our infrastructure set up for having people come in. And it turns out that people with disabilities, given that they have other comorbidities, are more prone to healthcare challenges. So really, what I think the idea of this comes to the fore is, are we designing systems and processes that really take into account people's abilities? How do we do that? And are our organizational structures built? Are they resilient to their task? That's really a big question, at least the way we've been looking at it. Of course, we've not addressed all aspects of those big picture questions, but we are trying to take that big picture question, I would say, in smaller chunks, as research would allow. Yeah, and then there are other challenges, right? So for example, what would happen if your firm's business just fundamentally disappears 50-60% overnight? And how do we actually think about managing such large scale pivots? And that's where, like I was saying, community becomes really important component of it. your local supply chain ecosystem becomes a really important component of this, and presumably we need to look at that. And we also have a couple of other. I think there was one slide before that, right, Dave? Yes. So when we, for example, we are doing a project with colleagues across different, in UK and in the US, where what we did was we went out and collected more than about 543 innovations or pivots that firms have executed, in their operations. And this is across a range of countries. There are about 80 countries in our sample. Across continents. And what we really find is that, companies are being really innovative about how they use what they know, right? And these pivots, for example, range from products to, next slide, please, Dave. Thank you. So these pivots range from new products to fundamentally new processes to even changing their entire supply chains, in a very short span of time. And things like contactless supply chains, right? So where you're walking into a restaurant and you can pretty much do a whole bunch of transactions contactless. You are trying to access buildings and factories for workers, where the operations are designed in somewhat of a contactless manner. So those are very fascinating in terms of how we are going to approach our overall design down the road. Because what happens if another pandemic like this hits? I have several examples of these. Just for example, the Royal Mint in the UK. They are, so going back to this idea of hyper agility, they are not known for making any product. They have never made any product other than coins in their whole history. And they turned around to make face visors. And here is the scaling of this example, just incredible. So the moment they knew the problem, they came out and they developed a visor in 8 hours, right? And they got it approved through the NHS and WHO. Based on the WHO specs, they got it approved through the NHS. And on day 1, they were making one visor every 3 minutes. And on day 10, they were making one visor every 2 seconds with zero prior experience of making products. That, I think, is just incredible, just in terms of the scaling. I've not seen companies or examples of companies that have managed to scale something totally new when they had zero experience of the product in the past. So experience really doesn't matter. So there are others, like, for example, there's this Cacophony project we found in New Zealand, where they were using these thermal imaging cameras to basically save birds, because these birds were being eaten up by predators. And they quickly pivoted and used those thermal imaging cameras to start identifying temperature screening for humans. Very, very fascinating examples of how there were some fundamental on the Eden Park, for example, they were doing UV technologies to detect fake diamonds and real diamonds. Actually, it turns out that this was a technology that the company was developing with Urbana-Champaign, one of the university collaborations. They quickly scaled it up to building disinfectants for surfaces in hospitals, planes, restaurants, and their business went up like, very fast, about 10 to 20 times in a very short span of time. And then, like, companies like Johnson Controls, completely different process example, where they helped build a multidisciplinary 1,000-bed hospital in 20 days, fitting things like video surveillance system, nurse calling system, fire alarms, wireless networks to get patient information and conform to local norms. And I thought some of these examples, I have a couple more actually later on, which are, can you, one more slide, Dave? Thank you. And here are sort of some on the Far East, like, in Vietnam, for example, this is a industry commons example. And we have also seen this in the US in one of our research on agri-business. The dragon fruit business suddenly plummeted. And here was a bakery that actually stepped in. Of course, the prices went down from $1.72 to 26 cents. And they developed a dragon fruit baguette, and that sort of really, made made the demand take off. In 2 weeks, they got 30 metric tons of demand, and in India, for example, there's another company that used to make ventilators for rooftops, AC vents, and they changed to make, disinfectant towers. So now they are selling all these disinfectant towers to hospitals, and we have a ton of such examples. That's what our research is all about right now. But I think that essentially what this is saying is that we can do a lot more with what we have. The question is, have we figured that out? And that calls for this issue of mapping what you know and how it can be useful in fundamentally different ways, right? So I think I want to stop here and maybe see if there are responses to the thoughts.
Yeah, no, I think they're really important thoughts, and I think they're great examples of the type of flexibility and pivot that we're kind of talking about. And I
And
think
you
it
just
really,
ran something really interesting. Do you mind, sorry, Dave, going back to that? So this
Yeah.
is another example we found where, industry comments in UK, for example, they put together a supply chain for ventilator where, of course, the government was involved because of the NHS. And they did this scale up challenge where they had more than 30 partners coming together to create an entire ventilator supply chain out of nowhere. So this is what I was saying before, that it's really important to understand what the ecosystem competencies are, so you are ready to use it when it comes. And maybe it also calls for a fundamentally different role for the civic infrastructure, the governments, how they are looking at what kind of corporations are there in the state and the country, and how those competencies can be leveraged in sort of synergistic ways, right? So that's the idea of commons, how we can leverage them, is also a bigger picture question, right? So thank you.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really important issue, and it kind of gets us to how do we look to the future, right? How do we try and find ways to turn these challenges into real opportunities, right? And so, Stan, as you kind of reflect on some of your experiences, what types of things would you recommend folks think a little bit about?
Yeah, so I've actually worked in the resilience space. Your question asks a little bit about this with actually one of Sriram's and yours and my colleague, Steve Melnick, for the last few years. And there's an hour-long story behind it, but what we learned from talking to a number of companies, some of which I'm sure are even represented in our participant list today, is that resilience is something that can be invested in by firms. And we very routinely think about CapEx for new facilities. We think about investing in training for our employees to, reduce times and increase efficiency. We don't often think about investing in resilience itself. And it somewhat makes sense, because if we start to invest in being able to deal with something which is a low probability event, a pandemic, an earthquake hitting Michigan, which, we get winter storms, but we don't get hurricanes, we don't get earthquakes. So if we plan for the wrong things, those investments don't look very good on the balance sheet. So we would need to plan for the right things, the higher probability things. But as we talked with company about how do I avoid a disruption of some type? How do I contain it when it actually happens? Once I've contained it, how do I stabilize my operations and then return? I'm going across this top axis here, back up to performance. They talk to us about different classes of investments and the discovery of and information about these events was very, very important early on when these are going on. So when your supplier begins to have financial trouble, has a union strike that might be on the horizon, if you find out about that earlier, if you have better information about the impacts of that, that may allow you to avoid a disruption. You bring another supplier on, you build ahead so that you can manage the time period when they might be offline. We can invest in these kinds of things. If we end up not needing them, again, it's difficult to explain later, but they're useful when we have them. That network design element that I talked about earlier fills this center area. The way we typically do this is buffers. We buffer it with system capacity. We buffer it with extra raw materials, extra finished goods, more flexible workforce so that we can bring people to the task when some of them get sick because of whatever it might be. This past year, we've seen a lot of this. And so we tend to spend more on buffers than anything because they can always be burned down if it's raw materials or finished goods, but maybe we invest even more in those. Operational flexibility has a lot of utility. Are there different things we can use in the bill of materials? I talked earlier about the chip shortage is really affecting a lot of CPG as well as automotive brands. You know, if there were other things that could be used in place of those, then they wouldn't have to worry about reducing their productivity as in the way that they are. So wherever we have that capability, and then security in our systems so that bad things don't get visited upon them, and then preparedness. I spent a number of years in a job where we spend lots and lots of time preparing for things that might happen. And you know, when trouble came down the road to us, it wasn't often exactly like what we had planned for. But if we had 7 or 10 plans on the shelf, we could pull chapter 1 out of this one and chapter 3 out of that one and chapter 5 out of another plan. And so the activity of that preparation and planning for, you know, what might go on, you know, the military does a lot of this kind of what if type of exercises. I know GM spends a fair amount of time looking into the future to see, you know, what things should their war room be ready for. But investing in these types of things, you know, give us that adaptability, flexibility, pliability that I talked about earlier, and that Sriram also mentioned, to give us a more resilient system. But again, hopefully we get to use these. So we need to invest in these in the right places so that it's not just we spent a whole bunch of money preparing for this situation, it never happened. You know, the collateral benefits need to be recognized of these as well.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, right? As supply chain professionals, we have to have an investment mindset. You know, we really have to be able to build a business case for why these types of investments are appropriate. And you know, I think the framework you've shared, Stan, is a really important one. I'm kind of curious, though. You know, Sriram, you raised a very interesting issue on the people front, right? You know, how do we really think about you know, deeper engagement for those with disabilities and helping support and drive organizations. Did you have any luck and any insight in how to build a business case around that in terms of what the benefit is and how that type of a strategy can be really elevated within the organization?
That's a great question, Dave. I would say that it's still a work in progress. But one thing is there. I think the way we like to think about it is that you can certainly build a business case on both the demand side and the supply side. So there is actually, we are doing some research where our early results are showing that consumers have much higher willingness to pay, particularly when products are made by people with disabilities, when organizations tend to support them. And of course, now with heightened awareness around DEI, I do feel that companies these are ideal times for companies to take a step in the right direction in that front. The big picture really is that they need to actually think about, are there systems and processes designed to take that into account. In fact, we did a podcast for Supply Chain Management Review in the first week of January, where we have talked about one of our articles in that front. You know, where we sort of lay out a stepwise structure for how companies should be looking at this. And I'd be happy to share the article if anybody's interested. And yeah.
Great. That's fantastic. Fantastic. Well, I really appreciate both of you taking time to share some insights here. We have been getting some questions coming in from folks, and I want to make sure we leave some good time to talk about those. One has come in from Josh that is directly related to what we were just chatting about. His question is essentially, you know, what does the ability of supply chains to be flexible and responsive say about the limits of AI technology and big data in driving supply chains that are predictable, right? There's a lot of talk about using technology to make our supply chains more predictable. But you know, his comment is, look, when we have a cost reduction mindset and believe that that's the only thing that we're delivering from a supply chain standpoint, it's kind of hard. It's kind of hard to make that work. how would you react to that? Is there a way to, really make these unplanned aspects of the supply chain more prominent and find a way to monetize or really, build that better business case?
You know,
It's a tough question.
it's a great question. Um, Maybe I can take a stab at it. The thing to me is the following, right? So how are we using these technologies in building a business case for the overall firm? Because in the end, it is the firm that creates the value. Its technologies are enablers of value. So the question is that what are the components in which these technologies are being used? So for example, in one of our own research projects, we are looking at a very substantial product where they are using IoT, AI, and everything else. Now the question becomes, what is the business case for building these technologies into the product? And what ended up happening was that the company's business model fundamentally changed. They could not incorporate the technology without addressing the question of what is the business model? How are we making the revenues? So for example, let's say you are selling a vehicle, General Motors. I'm just picking an example. I'm not saying that is the company or anything like that. It's an automobile company we work with. It's not so let's say OnStar has been around with GM for a long time. Now, can OnStar influence vehicle sales on a positive side? But it could also be that now with Uber, OnStar type technologies can be even more powerful in using and monitoring, reusing vehicles, for example, and vehicle sales can go down. Maybe service revenues are going to go up. So technology opens up all sorts of possibilities on that front, right? So I don't know if that's a good enough answer to that, but certainly, Stan, I'm sure, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but
Yeah, Josh's question brings up a persistent challenge we have, I think, in supply chain, and that is that our profit lever is so good, right? If we reduce supply chain cost by $1, profitability goes up by $1 so long as we keep performance where it was. Whereas if we sell $1 extra product, we make whatever our rate is on that. And so there is this profit perspective on what we do, and we lose sight of the value proposition of that dollar or that $1 million spent. I think as it relates to the AI part of that question, so much of that is about making that better decision for our systems. And I think you've probably picked up, Josh, from our discussion so far, is right now so much is in flux that maybe AI is helpful then, because we can rerun decisions that, okay, the situation's just changed. Let's unleash the AI on this. If we can get that spin cycle working quicker, maybe we can get closer to a really good solution than we can without those techniques and without the ability to look at all that big data. Unfortunately, it all presumes that our processes are not so laid in stone that we can then respond to what that new state of where we should go, that our systems provide for us as an opportunity to either save money or increase profitability, increase customer service, things like that. And so I think as businesses are investing more and more in these capabilities, they also need to invest in the processes around those capabilities to actually do something with them, rather than just, we've got this answer, but that's fine. We are unable to do that because of these other features.
Yeah. I think those are.
One more thing I quickly wanted to add to this
Yeah.
is that, there's a secondary component to this, that when we think about AI, it's also technology elements of these. I think it also opens up new sources of value, right? So for example, the company we were studying, they started out by implementing IoT, all these technologies into one big product for one use case. But suddenly they found that they could create multiple segments of use cases that were adjacent use cases. and then that formed alternative streams of revenue, right? So in some cases, some of these unstructured, unplanned aspects, if you're open to it, it might actually open a fundamentally new source of revenue for you also. That's one thing I wanted to sort of just put it out there.
Yeah, yeah. So there's another question here from Margaret, and I think it's also a very interesting question, and that is, we talked a lot about corporate mindset and that we need to think differently about a lot of the things that we do. She's essentially asking, is there any evidence, or do we have any insight into whether having a chief supply chain officer that really oversees the totality, does that have any contribution? Is that helping organizations build this more strategic mindset, and does it help make a business case? I don't know if either of you have any insights or evidence on anything on that organizational front, right? How do we become more strategic and more aligned and more connected to, as Sriram said, the value generation side of our businesses?
I'm not sure I've seen enough of a sample amid COVID to be able to answer that. I mean, the obvious hope is that yes, it is the case. But what I'll say is from the folks I've talked to, I just got off the phone yesterday with an organization, and the folks in the transportation part of the business and the folks in the compliance part of the business couldn't even agree on sharing data with each other. And you'd like to have thought that they were both working under the same person, even if it wasn't the chief supply chain officer. And so I'm pessimistic that it's necessarily there, and in part because I'm not sure that even when we say we've got a chief supply chain officer, that it isn't just that's only the person in charge of supply. I mean, the Michigan State perspective on this would be that the chief supply chain officer would at least as a minimum have oversight over the purchasing, sourcing, production and movement and storage, as well as customer service of an organization. And it's few and far between exec that I've met that has purview over as broad of a perspective of supply chain as we try and take in the Broad supply chain program.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with Stan. I think you're absolutely right. But there is a lot of research also out there that sort of takes a more macro level view. Like, for example, there are studies that show that companies that announce a chief supply chain officer experience higher stock returns. Like, but these are short term, right? Like,
Right.
in a small event window, like 3-day event window. Perhaps I don't know how it translates into larger scale implications. Yeah.
Excellent, excellent. So I have one last question that I'd like to pose. This is also one that you may or may not have specific examples to, but Chuck has asked the question, are we aware of any specific firms that made well-timed supply chain capability investments, hardware, software, whatever the case may have been, that enabled better performance during COVID? In other words, were there any things that they specifically did that really enabled them to survive and perhaps thrive, right? The question, how do we grow during crisis, I think is an important one. Do either of you have thoughts or ideas on that one?
Well, Stan, do you want me to go first, or?
Go for it.
No, yeah, the one thing I want to say is that this really depends on the scenario planning. And this is what I was saying before, that, the competency mapping is very critical in this setup. So, for example, the ventilator companies, the examples that I was showing earlier on, they could all be construed from that vantage point. But what they ended up doing was they knew what their competencies are, and in COVID, it sort of came out to the fore. So they could use those opportunities. But really, it's about the various scenarios under which your competencies come into play. That's sort of probably another way of looking at the same issue. I think that's all I had to say about that. Yeah.
Dave, we've got a really great couple great PhD programs in our department, and we actually just graduated a student 2 years ago who coincidentally was working on her dissertation on customer-facing systems for buy online and pick up in store. She'd been working on this from 2016 through 2019. And so from the research, we're seeing that, it definitely affects performance. And anecdotally, I can say, like all of us as a shut-in, availing myself of these kinds of services a lot more, you can tell who had been investing in these capacities and who has a phone number to customer service. And when you get to our parking lot, give us a call. We'll throw it in your trunk. And so, I mean, there's been a movement in the e-commerce space towards some capabilities that have been richly rewarded amid COVID. But in the B2B space, I think anybody that's been investing in greater information sharing and greater visibility has probably been benefiting more than their colleagues that aren't, because as we talked about, things have been turbulent. The quicker, the easier, the clearer I can see those waves coming to shore, the easier it is to decide to run up the beach or grab a surfboard and go have fun with it. So.
Yeah, I think those are great examples. I want to thank both of you for taking time this afternoon to share these great insights and kind of reflect on things you're hearing. To me, this is really all about us as supply chain professionals beginning to think more around capabilities and platforms instead of the more traditional linear thought process that so often permeates what we do. And again, I'm really grateful for the time. I want to take just a second as we wrap up here to make you aware of some other opportunities. We've obviously got a lot of executive education programs in the supply chain area where these types of issues get talked about. And we would encourage you, if these are of interest or value, to please check them out. I also know, Sriram, you're doing a podcast as well. Is that correct?
That's right. So yeah, we are going to launch a podcast. Actually, it's a Broad College podcast called Abilities, Opportunities, and Future of Work. In collaboration with the state. The idea is to sort of talk about how companies are leveraging disability talent, both from an employee standpoint and a firm standpoint. So if you are interested in participating in our podcast, we would love to hear from you. So you can send me an email, and certainly that would be great. Thank you.
Excellent. Excellent. Appreciate it very much. So many opportunities to continue to engage with the Supply Chain Management Department and the Broad College overall. So with that, Stan and Sriram, thank you again so much for sharing these great insights. Thank you to all of you who joined us today, and appreciate very much the questions that have come in. We hope you all continue to remain healthy and safe, and hopefully we will see you all soon at another supply chain event.